Okay, let's start. Number 1. The Oronteus Finaeus map. The year is 1959. You're Charles Hapgood, a history professor at Keene State College, digging through old maps in the Library of Congress for anything to back up a theory nobody in your department wants to hear. You pull a 1531 world map by a French cartographer named Oronteus Finaeus, and something at the bottom of it stops you cold. A landmass wrapped around the pole. Rivers on it. Not ice shelves, not glaciers, actual river mouths cutting into a coastline. The kind of detail you'd only draw if you'd seen open land. Oronteus Finaeus wasn't some backroom mapmaker. He was one of the most respected cartographers in France, a mathematics professor at the Royal College in Paris, and by 1531, his work was already circulating across Europe under his own name, which mattered in an era when most maps got copied and recopied without credit. He drew the world in a double heart shape, a stylistic choice popular at the time, and wrapped the southern landmass around the base of it like a collar. Mountain ranges run through the interior, estuaries cut into the coast at regular intervals, no permanent ice cap, no frozen coastline. Just land, the way land looks when nothing's covering it, drawn with enough internal detail that it reads like a real place, instead of an artist's guess at what might be down there. Hapgood published his conclusion in 1966 in a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. His argument was specific. Antarctica had been locked under ice for thousands of years by the time Finaeus was alive, so wherever this map came from, it wasn't drawn from a 16th century voyage south. Finaeus had to be copying something older, much older. Hapgood's timeline pushed the source material back before the last major glaciation buried the continent, which means, if he's right, somebody was sailing and charting a coastline that hasn't been visible to human eyes in longer than recorded history has existed. That's the claim that made this map famous. Zecharia Sitchin picked it up and folded it into his own writing on ancient contact. So did Graham Hancock, who used it as a cornerstone for his own theory of a lost seafaring civilization erased by catastrophe, a society advanced enough to chart coastlines but wiped out before it could leave anything else behind. And here's the thing about the claim. Once you say it out loud, it's hard to unhear. A precise, detailed, professionally drawn coastline of a continent nobody in Europe was supposed to know existed yet, drawn centuries before Antarctica shows up on any official record. What nobody in that first wave of excitement seemed to ask, though, was whether the map actually needed a pre-Ice Age source to explain what it shows, or whether there was a simpler explanation sitting right there in the geology. Geologist Paul Heinrich looked into it, and his answer wasn't what Hancock wanted. West Antarctica's bedrock, he pointed out, sits hundreds of feet below sea level across most of its surface, pressed down over millions of years by the sheer weight of the ice sitting on top of it. Strip away every inch of that ice sheet today and you don't get rolling rivers and open plains. You get a submerged landmass, flooded in places, a scatter of islands where the mountain peaks poke through, nothing like the continuous river-cut coastline Finaeus drew. So even in the most generous version of the theory, where someone really did map this part of the world before the ice came, the shape Finaeus committed to paper doesn't match the shape underneath. It can't. The land itself would have to rebound upward for centuries before it looked anything like his coastline. I mean, think about that for a second. The strongest piece of evidence for the theory turns out to work against the exact geology it's supposed to confirm. That doesn't make the map boring. If anything, it makes it stranger. Somebody in 1531 drew rivers at the bottom of the world, long before anyone had confirmed Antarctica was even there. Where that detail came from is still an open question, whether it's imagination, second-hand sailors' reports, or something else entirely. Nobody has closed the file on that. What it isn't, according to the bedrock itself, is a direct trace of some vanished, ice-free version of the seventh continent. But Hapgood didn't stop at Oronteus Finaeus' map. He needed something harder than one man's cartography to make his case, so he went looking for an actual instrument reading of what's under the ice. And in 1949, a team of scientists camped out in Queen Maud Land had already produced exactly that. Number 2. The 1949 Seismic Survey. The year is 1949, and you're camped at a base called Maudheim on a floating ice shelf in Queen Maud Land, 71 degrees south. You're part of the Norwegian, British, Swedish Antarctic expedition, the first genuinely international science team ever assembled on the continent, and Captain John G. Aver has split the work 3 ways. Norway runs meteorology and surveying, Sweden handles glaciology. Britain gets geology, which is a strange assignment on a continent buried under that much ice, because there's no rock anywhere in sight to study. So the British team does the only thing left available to them. They start setting off small explosive charges into the ice and timing how long it takes the shockwaves to bounce back. That's a seismic survey, and it's a lot less dramatic than it sounds. You detonate the charge, you measure the echo, and the delay tells you how far down the sound wave had to travel before it hit something solid. Deeper snow and ice means a longer wait. Solid rock means a sharper, faster bounce. The original point of the exercise was mundane, almost bureaucratic. The team needed to know ice thickness before deciding where it was safe to lay supply depots for the coming season. Nothing more romantic than logistics. But as those readings came back, night after night, they were doing something nobody had ever done before. For the first time in human history, someone was measuring what's actually underneath the Antarctic ice sheet. Not guessing, not extrapolating from a coastline sketch, measuring, with an instrument, and writing the numbers down. What came back was a landscape. Mountains, ridges, valleys, a full buried topography running under the ice, exactly the way it would under open sky anywhere else on Earth. And that data sat quietly in the scientific record for over a decade, filed away in expedition reports nobody outside a small circle of glaciologists ever read, until Charles Hapgood, working on his theory about the Piri Reis and Oronteus Finaeus maps, went looking for something harder than old ink to test them against. He found this survey and used it as his anchor point, the one piece of real, peer-reviewed instrument data in his whole argument. If the seismic readings lined up with what the old maps drew, that was his proof the maps weren't guesswork or coincidence. That was his proof somebody, a very long time ago, had genuinely seen this coastline with their own eyes, and lived long enough to draw it down. Here's where it gets shakier, though, and it's worth sitting with the actual numbers instead of the story built on top of them. The 1949 survey covered a narrow strip of Queen Maud land, a sliver. Geologist Paul Heinrich ran the comparison later and found the expedition's actual coverage amounted to less than 1% of the coastline the Piri Reis map draws across the bottom of the world. Less than 1%, standing in for the confirmation of an entire continent's ancient shoreline. And somehow, it gets worse from there, because the sections of bedrock the survey did capture don't cleanly match the old maps either, once you lay them side by side without the excitement doing the work for you. None of that makes the 1949 expedition any less real, or any less important. It was a genuine breakthrough, the first hard data anyone had ever pulled from underneath that ice, and it opened the door to every radar and satellite survey that followed it for the next 70 years. Geaver's team spent months out there in brutal cold running lines of charges across the ice shelf, and what they built from it became the foundation every later Antarctic map would eventually be checked against. Nobody misused the survey while it was happening. The misuse came 17 years later, when someone stretched that narrow strip of confirmed bedrock into proof for a map of the whole continent's coastline, a sliver of real data doing the job of an entire coastline. That's the part that should make you pause every time this survey gets cited as the smoking gun in someone else's theory. But if one map's claim can collapse once you check the actual coverage area, what happens when a completely different map builds its whole reputation on looking like confirmed science, while carrying a label the mapmaker himself printed admitting he made it up? Number 3. The Buache map. The year is 1739, and you're Philippe Buache, sitting in a Paris workshop surrounded by the raw reports of sailors who've spent years chasing icebergs around the bottom of the world, cataloging every account of size and drift and direction they bring back. You're the king's chief geographer, a respected figure in French cartography circles, and you're about to publish a map that, 3 centuries later, alt history channels will hold up as the single strongest proof that ancient civilizations mapped Antarctica's hidden bedrock. You title it Carte des Terres Australes, and you draw the southern pole not as one landmass but two, split by an interior sea running through the middle, connected to the ocean by straits on either side. Here's why that map still gets passed around today, decade after decade, on forums and now on social media. Antarctica actually is split, underneath all that ice, into 2 separate pieces of bedrock, East Antarctica and West Antarctica, divided by a deep basin and the Transantarctic Mountains running clear across the continent. Radar and satellite surveys confirmed that shape in the 20th century, long after anyone could have walked out there to check it by eye. So when people discover Buache drew almost the same 2-island layout 200 years earlier on a map printed in Paris using nothing but sailors' notes, the conclusion writes itself online in about 4 words. He had older source maps. It's a clean story. It's also, once you go read what Buache actually wrote on his own chart, not the story he was telling. For a while, that story worked, because nobody was reading Buache's actual labels closely enough. Sitting right there on the speculative landmass, printed in his own hand, are two words that undo the whole theory in an instant: conjectured and suspected. Buache wasn't claiming he'd copied an ancient chart of a real coastline. He was telling you, in plain print, that this part of the map was a guess. His actual reasoning had nothing to do with lost civilizations. Sailors like Jean-Baptiste Bouvet had been reporting enormous icebergs drifting up from the far south, bigger than anything a small landmass could produce. Buache's theory was that a frozen interior sea, fed by rivers and mountain ranges he'd never seen, had to be sitting down there generating ice on that scale. He built the whole shape from that single idea, worked backward from the icebergs to a cause, and drew what the cause would have to look like. And here's the quiet before the storm on this one. Because when researchers actually laid Buache's coastline over real bedmap radar data centuries later, pixel for pixel, the match falls apart almost immediately. The proportions are off. The straight locations don't line up. The interior sea Buache imagined doesn't correspond to anything that's actually down there. No basin in that shape. No channel running where his map puts one. It's not a smudged copy of the real bedrock, it's a different shape entirely, arrived at through completely different reasoning, that happens to share the loose idea of two pieces with the real geology, and nothing more specific than that. Almost nobody sharing this map online has actually gone and laid the two shapes over each other. If you're new here, and you're the kind of person who actually wants to know when a claim like this checks out and when it doesn't, this is basically what the channel does every week, so it's worth hitting subscribe now before we keep going. None of that erases what's genuinely interesting about Buache. A working scientist, using nothing but iceberg reports and a hunch about physics, sitting in a Paris office with no way to ever confirm it in his own lifetime, landed on the right general answer: a divided continent, for entirely the wrong reasons, generations before anyone had the technology to check him. He got lucky on the broad strokes and missed almost everything specific: the proportions, the straight placement, the shape of the interior. It's an impressive guess, built from patience and a working theory instead of any lost record. It's still a guess, and Buache never once claimed otherwise. But if the most famous, confirmed map turns out to be a documented guess, the next question gets bigger than any single chart. It's the question of why an entire continent, real or theorized, ends up legally untouchable in the first place. Number 4. The Antarctic Treaty. The year is 1959, and you're in a conference room in Washington, D.C., watching delegates from 12 countries sign a document that will end up controlling more territory than any single agreement in modern history. Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, the United States. Every nation that had run a serious scientific program in Antarctica during the International Geophysical Year, just 2 years earlier, is at that table. What they're signing isn't a treaty about maps or lost civilizations. It's a treaty about who gets to touch the ground. The Antarctic Treaty took effect in June of 1961, and its core idea was almost radical for the era. 7 of those 12 nations already had overlapping unresolved territorial claims on the continent, claims that in some cases physically stacked on top of each other on a map. Instead of forcing a resolution, the treaty just froze every claim in place, permanently, without recognizing or denying a single one of them. No military activity, no weapons testing, nothing but science allowed on the entire continent, and any base or station has to open its doors to inspection by any other signatory, no notice required. For a Cold War document written while the Soviet Union and the United States were racing each other into orbit and stockpiling warheads aimed at each other's capitals, an agreement that both superpowers actually respected, on a landmass this size, is its own kind of small miracle. But the treaty only covered so much. It never explicitly banned mining, and by the 1980s, with oil crises fresh in everyone's memory, and geologists increasingly confident there were real mineral and petroleum deposits under that ice, that gap started to look like a problem. So in 1991, the same signatory nations went back to the table, this time in Madrid, and added something much sharper: the Protocol on Environmental Protection, now known as the Madrid Protocol, took the ambiguity out entirely. Article 7 states it in language a first-year law student could parse without help, any activity relating to Antarctic mineral resources, other than actual scientific research, is flatly prohibited. No licensing process, no permit you can apply for, no exception carved out for anybody. That's the real, documented, on-the-record answer to why no nation digs in Antarctica. Not a hidden base, not a buried civilization somebody's protecting. A treaty 40-plus nations actually signed, actually enforce, and actually keep, decade after decade, without a single major violation on the books. And here's the part of the story that expands way past the mining question itself, because the Madrid Protocol didn't stop at minerals. It locked down waste disposal, marine pollution, wildlife protection, and environmental impact assessments for every single expedition down to individual research huts, turning the whole continent into the closest thing the modern world has to a planet-sized nature preserve with armed diplomatic backing behind it. Now, here's where the online version of this story usually goes sideways. Article 25 of the Protocol allows any consultative party to request a formal review of the mining ban once 50 years have passed since the Protocol entered force in 1998. Run that math and you land on 2048. Somewhere along the way, that review clause got flattened online into "the ban expires in 2048, a claim that shows up in comment sections and thumbnail text constantly. It's a real, specific misreading of a real, specific legal clause. A review is not an expiration. Neither the protocol nor the original treaty carries a termination date anywhere in the text. As of 2024, 42 nations have signed on to the Madrid Protocol, 29 of them full consultative parties with a vote on how it gets applied, and the ban has never once come close to being lifted. So the legal case for why no nation will dig doesn't need a conspiracy at all. It needs a filing cabinet, 42 signatures, and one recurring meeting on the calendar, which, once you sit with that for a second, is almost more unsettling than a cover-up would be, because it means the restriction isn't hidden anywhere. It's public. Anyone can read it, in full, in any language the treaty was translated into, and the whole continent still stays locked, generation after generation, with no sign of that changing. But a treaty explains the digging. It says nothing about the single most recognized map in this entire case, the one every list like this one eventually has to reckon with directly. Number 5. The Piri Reis map. The year is 1929, and you're a librarian working through storage rooms inside Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, once the seat of the Ottoman sultans, cataloging documents that have sat untouched for centuries. You pull a gazelle skin parchment fragment, edges torn, colors still sharp. Someone has drawn coastlines across it in careful, confident lines. Europe, Africa, the full sweep of South America's eastern coast, rendered with an accuracy that shouldn't be possible for the era once you check the date signed in the corner. 1513. And curling along the bottom of the page, connected to South America in a way that's been argued over for a century now, there's a southern landmass with mountains, rivers, and a coastline running east to west. The map belongs to Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer who fought naval campaigns across the Mediterranean and, in whatever hours the empire's wars left him, built some of the most detailed maps of his century. He wasn't hiding what he'd made this one from. Piri Reis wrote his own sourcing directly onto the parchment, in his own hand, stating he'd compiled the map from roughly 20 older charts, some Portuguese, some Arab, and, according to his own notes, at least one he attributes to material connected to Christopher Columbus's voyages. This was already, by his own account, a compilation, a patchwork built from other men's work, not an original survey. That didn't stop the theory that made this map famous. In 1966, Charles Hapgood, the same professor who'd already staked his reputation on the Oronteus Finaeus map, published his most explosive claim yet in Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Hapgood argued the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map lines up with Queen Maud Land, the exact stretch of Antarctica the 1949 seismic survey had measured under the ice. If that match was real, Hapgood said, the source material behind Piri Reis's map had to predate 4000 BCE, thousands of years before any civilization known to history had the seafaring capability to chart a coastline that far south. Somebody, something, had gotten there first, and left records that outlasted whatever wiped them out. This is the claim underneath half of this entire video, the reason this map gets pulled out in comment sections and documentary segments more than any other piece of evidence in the whole case, and it deserves the full weight of what actually undoes it, piece by piece, because there isn't just one hole in the argument, there are three. and they stack. First, the coastline itself. Geologist Paul Heinrich, examining Hapgood's comparison directly, found that Hapgood had matched the map against a hypothetical ice-free surface of Antarctica without correcting for post-glacial rebound, the slow rise of bedrock once the weight of the ice sheet lifts off it. Skip that correction, and you're comparing two different shapes and calling them the same one. Second, the survey itself. That 1949 expedition, the one this whole claim leans on, covered less than 1% of the coastline the Piri Reis map actually draws across the bottom of the world. A sliver standing in for the whole continent, from a single base camp working a narrow strip of Queen Maud land over one field season. And here's the detail that everyone citing this claim online tends to skip entirely. Subsequent, far more complete surveys, using decades more radar and satellite data than Hapgood ever had access to, show no significant resemblance between the real coastline and what's actually drawn on the map at all. Third, and this one's the quiet killer, the timeline itself doesn't survive contact with ice core dating. Modern cores pulled from deep inside the sheet place Antarctica's last genuinely ice-free period at over 10 million years ago. 10 million, not 4000 BCE. Not any window where a seafaring human civilization, forgotten or otherwise, could plausibly have existed to chart it. None of that makes the Piri Reis map less remarkable. A 16th century admiral, working from a stack of second-hand charts during active naval campaigns, still produced one of the most accurate maps of his era. Accurate enough that 600 years later people are still arguing about a detail at the very edge of the parchment. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry, if the accountants in question are cartographers. But the specific claim that made this map a household name in alt history circles doesn't survive its own evidence once you actually run it down. But the map isn't the only piece of Hapgood's case. He needed a mechanism, a real, physical explanation for how an entire ancient coastline could vanish under ice in the first place. And for that, he went looking for the single most surprising cosigner this whole story ever gets. Number 6. Hapgood's crustal displacement theory. The year is 1958, and you're an editor at Pantheon Books in New York, holding a manuscript that arrived with something attached to the front of it that no editor expects to see twice in a career. A foreword, written and signed by Albert Einstein. The book is Earth-Shifting Crust, by Charles Hapgood, the same college professor who would go on to build his Antarctica maps theory 8 years later. And Einstein, the most famous scientist alive, has read this thing seriously enough to put his own name on the front of it. Hapgood's central idea was mechanical, not mystical, and that's part of why it landed with a physicist in the first place, instead of getting laughed out of a serious publishing house. He argued that ice accumulates unevenly at the poles over thousands of years, piling up off to one side rather than perfectly centered on the axis, and that once enough of that mass builds up, the whole outer crust of the Earth, not the continents drifting slowly against each other over eons, but the entire solid shell all at once, can slip around the still-centered molten core underneath it, like the peel of an orange sliding loose over the fruit inside. In his model, each shift takes roughly 5,000 years to unfold, followed by 20 to 30,000 quiet years with no movement at all, and no single shift ever moves the crust more than 40 degrees. If true, it would explain, in one clean mechanism, how a coastline that once sat somewhere warmer could end up buried under permanent polar ice within a geologically short window, without needing continents to physically travel anywhere. It's the physical engine underneath every map claim in this entire video, the thing that's supposed to make the maps possible instead of impossible. And Einstein didn't just lend his name for marketing, the way a celebrity endorsement gets tacked onto a product. His foreword actually engages with the mechanism on its merits, treating the idea of a rapid, large-scale crust displacement as worth serious investigation rather than dismissing it outright. That's the real, sourced, genuinely strange fact driving this whole section. Not a rumor, not a misattributed quote pulled out of context, an actual foreword, in an actual physicist's own words, in an actual published book still sitting in libraries and on Internet Archive today, for anyone to go read cover to cover. But here's the reversal, and it's a rough one. Hapgood's book didn't just propose crust displacement as one possible mechanism among several. It explicitly argued against continental drift, the idea that the continents themselves slowly move over millions of years, dismissing it as unsupported by the evidence available at the time. That wasn't a fringe position in 1958. Plenty of serious geologists still doubted continental drift back then. But within about a decade, the evidence for it became undeniable, and by the early 1970s the scientific community had fully developed what's now called plate tectonics, the exact framework Hapgood had spent his book arguing against, and it's stood up to every test since. Modern measurements do confirm something called true polar wander, a real documented slow drift in how the Earth's rotational axis lines up relative to the crust over geological time, tracked today using satellites and precision gravity instruments Hapgood never had access to. That part of Hapgood's instinct wasn't crazy, but the actual measured rate of that drift is tiny compared to what his model requires, nowhere close to a coastline erasing shift inside 5,000 years. The mechanism that was supposed to explain how ancient maps could show an ice-free Antarctica just doesn't move fast enough, or far enough, to do the job Hapgood needed it to do. So the strangest fact in this whole video is a physicist as famous as Einstein reading a fringe theory seriously enough to put his own name on it, engaging with the mechanism in good faith, years before the evidence that would eventually rule it out had even been gathered. Nobody covered anything up. The measurements just hadn't been taken yet, and once they were, Hapgood's version of the mechanism didn't survive them. But theories and old maps only explain so much. At some point, a government actually has to decide what to do with a continent this contested, this cold, and this hard to police. And in 1946, one country decided the answer was the largest single military operation ever sent south. Number 7. Operation Highjump. The year is 1946, and you're standing on the docks in August, watching Task Force 68 load out for the largest single operation the United States Navy has ever sent to Antarctica. 13 ships. An aircraft carrier, 33 aircraft rigged for cold weather flight, 4,700 men. Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, already a national hero from earlier polar expeditions, is organizing the whole thing, with Rear Admiral Ethan Larson commanding the task force in the field. Nothing this size had ever gone south before. Nothing this size has gone south since. The official name was blunt, the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, 1946 through 1947. The stated mission was to establish a permanent research base, Little America 4, on the Ross Ice Shelf, and to test the entire logistics chain, ships, planes, cold weather gear, fuel supply, under real Antarctic conditions, while mapping as much of the coastline and interior as physically possible. Byrd had been down there before, on smaller expeditions in the 1920s and 30s, but this was different in kind, not just in scale. A full military-grade dry run for operating a modern navy at the bottom of the world. By the time it wrapped, Highjump had charted hundreds of thousands of square miles and shot more than 70,000 aerial photographs, an intelligence and cartography haul that shaped Antarctic mapping for decades afterward, feeding directly into the very seismic and radar surveys later sections of this list depend on. And here's the detail most retellings skip entirely. Highjump ended early. Not in the following summer as originally planned, but in late February 1947, months ahead of schedule. The official reason is almost disappointingly practical. The Antarctic summer was closing fast, sea ice was thickening around the fleet, and losing an aircraft carrier to the ice for an entire winter was a risk the Navy wasn't willing to take. That's it. That's the whole reason. No battle, no retreat under fire, just a commander reading the ice charts and deciding not to gamble a carrier. But a fleet that large, wrapping up that fast, is exactly the kind of gap a story will rush to fill, and one did, fast, and it's still circulating today. In the years after Highjump, a book started circulating called The Missing Diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd. It claimed Byrd's fleet had been driven off by advanced aircraft launching from a hidden base, and that Byrd himself had flown through a polar opening into an inner world. It reads like Byrd's own words. It wasn't. The actual author was Walter Siegmeister, a Hollow Earth writer working under the pen name Raymond Bernard, who published it with no involvement from Byrd or his family at all. The Nazi version of the story runs parallel to that one. Rumors of a hidden installation called Base 211, tucked somewhere inside a region of Antarctica Germany had explored in 1938 and named Neuschwabenland, started circulating in German nationalist circles through the 1950s, and got amplified hard by a writer named Christoph Friedrich, a pen name for Ernst Zundel, a neo-Nazi publisher who built an entire mythology around a supposed Nazi resurgence hiding at the bottom of the world. And here's the detail that quietly ends both versions of the story at once. Highjump's actual flight logs, the real ones, on file, never crossed into the section of Antarctica Germany's pre-war expedition had explored in the first place. The fleet everyone claims got chased off the Nazi base, never flew anywhere near where that base was supposed to be. What's left once you strip out the hoax diary and the neo-Nazi publisher isn't nothing. It's still the largest Antarctic operation in history, a real logistics test, a real mapping project, involving thousands of actual men who spent months in some of the harshest conditions on the planet, ended early for a real mundane reason involving ice and a carrier's schedule. The mystery writers built their version on top of that scale after the fact, decades later, working from a fleet that was already impressive on its own, with no myth required. If you've made it this far, you're clearly the kind of person who wants the sourced version over the viral one, so go ahead and subscribe now, it genuinely helps. But no fleet, however large, has ever actually set a boot on the strangest confirmed feature buried under that ice. Number 8. The Gamburtsev Mountains. Enter a Soviet seismic team, working the deep interior of East Antarctica in 1958, running the same basic method the Norwegian, British, Swedish team had used 9 years earlier at Modheim. Charges, echoes, timing. Except the readings coming back don't make sense against what anyone expected to find there. East Antarctica sits on one of the oldest, most geologically stable chunks of continental crust on the planet, a slab that's been sitting quiet for longer than almost anywhere else on Earth. Stable crust like that is supposed to be flat, worn smooth by time. Instead, the echoes are bouncing back the way they would off real mountains. Sharp peaks, deep valleys, a full alpine range sitting directly under the ice, in a location where a mountain range has no business existing at all. That's the first sighting of what's now called the Gamburtsev Subglacial Mountains, named for the Soviet geophysicist who led the survey, and for decades, that 1958 discovery sat as a strange, unresolved data point, too remote, too deeply buried, and too logistically brutal to reach for anyone to properly investigate with the technology available at the time. The interior of East Antarctica is one of the most inaccessible places on the planet, colder and further from any coastline than almost anywhere else humans have ever tried to work. It took until 2007, during the International Polar Year, for 7 nations to finally pool the resources to go back and check, sending twin-engine aircraft loaded with ice-penetrating radar, gravity meters, and magnetometers over the same stretch of interior, flying grid patterns for 2 full field seasons to build a real, detailed picture of what's actually down there. That data folded into BedMap 2, and later BedMap 3, the ongoing international project mapping every inch of bedrock under the Antarctic ice sheet, one radar pass at a time. What they found is a full mountain range, buried under nearly 2 miles of ice, with peaks and valleys as pronounced as anything you'd see in the Alps if you stripped the ice away entirely, jagged summits and carved valleys sitting in total darkness under all that weight. And here's the detail that makes geologists genuinely excited rather than just curious. The Gamburtsevs are now understood as the likely birthplace of the entire East Antarctic ice sheet, the single largest ice sheet on Earth. The theory runs that these peaks, once exposed to the open sky, caught enough snow and cold air circulation to start the ice accumulating in the first place, a seed that grew, year after year, into a sheet covering most of a continent. A mountain range nobody could see for the entire span of that geological stability may have quietly decided how the bottom of the world would look for the rest of Earth's history, one snowfall at a time. That kind of stability, then a hidden range shaping an entire ice sheet, confirmed only through sound waves and radar bounced through miles of ice, never once by a person standing on the actual rock. No expedition has drilled down to those peaks. No boot has touched that stone. Every single fact anyone knows about the Gamburtsev Mountains, their height, their shape, their age, their role in building the ice sheet above them, comes from instruments reading through a barrier nobody has ever physically crossed, from aircraft flying miles above a range no camera has ever photographed directly. Compare that to the pyramid claims and the hidden base rumors this list has already worked through, and the contrast is almost funny. The wildest, most genuinely alien-sounding feature confirmed under Antarctic ice isn't a hoax, isn't a stretched theory built on a fragment of old parchment, isn't a hollow earth writer's invented diary. It's a real mountain range, verified by 7 governments' worth of radar data collected over 2 separate field seasons, that just happens to be completely unreachable by any human being alive, hidden in plain sight under one of the coldest, emptiest stretches of the planet. But if legitimate instruments can reveal something this enormous sitting quietly under the ice for that long, the next question is, what happens when those same instruments, or the images they produce, get read the wrong way, by people looking for something else entirely? Number 9. the Antarctica Pyramid. The year is 2016, and a satellite screenshot of the Ellsworth Mountains starts spreading across social media faster than anyone can moderate it. One peak, sitting among the range's jagged summits, has 4 clean sloping sides meeting at a point, the unmistakable silhouette of a pyramid, sitting in a place where nobody expects to find one. Within days, the theories stack on top of each other. An alien base. The remains of a lost, advanced civilization buried under the ice. A secret Nazi installation left over from the war. The clock on this one runs fast. The image spreads for maybe a week before anyone with actual expertise weighs in, and by then, millions of people have already seen the screenshot and made up their minds. Geologists didn't take long to catch up once they did look, even if the internet had already moved on by then. Dr. Mitch Darcy, at the German Research Center for Geosciences in Potsdam, examined the formation directly and gave it a name a lot less exciting than alien base. A nunatak. That's the term for a peak of solid rock that pokes up above the surrounding ice sheet or glacier, exposed because it's too tall and too steep for snow and ice to hold onto its surface. A common enough feature across Antarctica that most maps of the continent are dotted with them. Darcy's explanation for the shape itself was almost disappointingly mundane. The peaks are clearly composed of rock, he said, and it's just a coincidence that this particular one happens to have that shape, the same kind of coincidence that produces recognizable faces in cloud formations and rock walls everywhere else on Earth. Here's how that coincidence actually works, mechanically. When multiple glacial corries, the bowl-shaped hollows carved out by moving ice, converge on a single point from different directions, they leave behind a knife-edge ridge between each pair of them. Where 3 or more of those ridges meet at a summit, the result is a classic pyramidal peak, 4 or more steep faces converging at a point, and it's a shape that shows up on mountains all over the world, nowhere near Antarctica, nowhere near any conspiracy theory. Add in freeze-thaw weathering, water seeping into cracks in the rock, freezing, expanding, and fracturing off sheets of stone over hundreds of thousands of years, and you get faces sharp and flat enough to look engineered from the right angle. And that's the detail that actually kills the viral version of the story once you check it. The pyramid illusion depends entirely on the specific angle those first screenshots were taken from, the exact sun position, the exact camera position, the exact crop somebody chose before hitting post. Rotate the same peak in satellite or aerial imagery and the symmetry falls apart almost immediately. The eastern face is noticeably steeper than the others. The base is irregular, not the clean square footprint you'd expect from something built, rather than eroded over unimaginable stretches of time. What looked, from one frozen camera angle, like a monument, turns out to be a mountain that just happens to catch the light well from exactly one direction, and falls apart the second you look at it from anywhere else. None of that makes Antarctica's actual geology boring. If anything, a natural process precise enough to carve a near-perfect pyramid out of solid rock, with nobody designing it, no blueprint, no builder, working purely off ice, water, and time, is its own kind of remarkable. It just isn't the kind of remarkable this list is actually chasing. This one's worth including precisely because it's the debunk, the moment where the evidence runs out and the honest answer is, it's a rock. Because a video willing to say that plainly about its own weakest claim is worth trusting on the ones that actually hold up under the same scrutiny. But ruling out one manufactured mystery doesn't rule out the one place under all that ice that's still, genuinely, actively sealed off from every satellite, every radar pass, and every single camera that's ever been pointed at this continent, from orbit or from the ground. Number 10. Lake Vostok. The date is February 5, 2012, and you're standing at Vostok Station, the coldest, most isolated research base on the planet, watching a drill bit that's been descending for the better part of 2 decades finally break through the last stretch of solid ice. Below you, sealed beneath roughly 2.5 miles of ice sheet, sits a body of water roughly the size of Lake Ontario, the largest subglacial lake ever confirmed in Antarctica, one of more than 400 that scientists now know exist under the continent's ice, and the only one large enough to have its own internal currents and tides, an entire hidden body of water behaving like a small inland sea. Lake Vostok had been sealed off from sunlight, from the surface atmosphere, from any contact with the rest of the planet, for an estimated 15 million years. 15 million years of total darkness, crushing pressure from the ice sitting on top of it, and complete isolation from every living thing above the ice sheet. That's not a typo, by the way. 15 million years is longer than modern humans have existed by a factor that's genuinely hard to picture, longer than most of the animal species alive today have existed, longer than the Himalayas have been at their current height, sealed the entire time under a lid nobody on the surface could get through. The Russian drilling program had been working toward this moment since the early 1990s, using radar to first confirm the lake was even there, buried under thousands of feet of accumulated snowfall that had compressed into solid ice over hundreds of thousands of years, then spending years perfecting a drilling method that wouldn't contaminate whatever was living inside it before anyone got a chance to study it properly. When the bit finally broke through, water under enormous pressure from the weight of the ice above surged back up the borehole and refroze almost immediately in the brutal cold, sealing itself again within hours. That refrozen plug became the sample. Researchers pulled it out the following season and ran it through genetic analysis, and what came back inside it was DNA. Fragments from organisms that had spent millions of generations evolving in a place with no sunlight, no fresh surface nutrients, and pressures that would crush most life on the surface, adapting to conditions that exist almost nowhere else on Earth, a whole ecosystem shaped entirely by isolation. If you're wondering how that's even legal to attempt without contaminating something that ancient, so is a chunk of the scientific community. The Russian team drew real, documented criticism for using kerosene-based drilling fluid to keep the borehole from refreezing during the descent, a choice that risked introducing surface bacteria into water that had been perfectly sealed for millions of years before anyone ever showed up with a drill. That's a real, unresolved argument inside the research itself, not a conspiracy, just a genuine scientific trade-off between reaching the lake at all and reaching it perfectly clean. And that's the detail that actually answers this video's own title, more directly than any map ever could. Lake Vostok isn't a theory. It isn't a contested coastline or a hypothetical civilization erased by catastrophe. It's a real, confirmed, still barely understood place, sitting under the ice right now, that took humanity 2 decades of drilling just to touch the surface of, and that we've still only sampled in the smallest possible way, one refrozen plug at a time. As of today, no submersible has ever explored its actual depths. Nobody has mapped its floor. Nobody knows exactly what else might be moving through that water, beyond the microscopic traces the ice plug carried up. Whatever else is living in that water, adapted to 15 million years of total isolation, is still down there, genuinely sealed, genuinely unexplored, no ancient map or crustal theory required to make it strange. 10 pieces of evidence, 4 centuries of maps, 1 real treaty, 1 hoax diary, and 1 lake that's still, right now, mostly a mystery. The maps turned out to be guesswork and misread geology, but the actual sealed, unexplored ground underneath this continent never needed help being strange. If you made it this far, tell me where you're watching from down in the comments. I genuinely read them, and subscribe for more of these before the next one goes up.